So I'll start with this question on philosophy. We'll start with the philosophy section. So it seems intuitively obvious to many that reducing suffering is morally urgent, though I've had discussions with people who seem to hold the moral position that ethics is just merely an aesthetic. Do you have a stance on this? What's your take?
What I recommend is that the people who say that it's just an aesthetic, if they ask them if they've ever suffered, because if they've never suffered, then of course they don't know what they're talking about. But if they have suffered, ask them whether relief from that suffering, reducing that suffering, is just an aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. So if someone has their fingernail ripped off, it feels like the urgency of reducing suffering is...
It's evident, it's urgent to the sufferer, obviously, but then there's this other minds problem, which you ask about later on. Mm-hmm. The fact is, I can't feel your pain, so I can always say this aesthetic nonsense, saying, oh, well, so reducing suffering is just an aesthetic question, because I don't feel your pain. And I don't think about my suffering when I think about suffering, reducing someone else's suffering.
I don't feel it directly, but I do have a sense of urgency to help someone if I see that their fingernails have been ripped off. I certainly wouldn't want to be the person in the state of mind doing the fingernail ripping off. I just think it would be absolutely horrible to be in a position where I had to do that sort of thing. So classical utilitarians usually think that we should see an overall increase in happiness, and that is happiness and suffering are morally symmetrical. So that is, increases in happiness and decreases in suffering are equal in magnitude of value. Yep. You don't agree with that?
Not only is that nonsense, but I could even show you why it's nonsense. Okay, with a correct analogy. If you in psychophysics, if you have let's say somebody touches a surface and it's vibrating very, very, very mildly, so it's below threshold, so they don't feel anything. And at some point it reaches threshold and they feel the vibration, and then it's growing, and it's growing in intensity. That's a normal one-dimensional psychophysical continuum. It's not like that, for example, with feeling hot and cold. Temperature, of course, physics is a one-dimensional continuum, and for a physicist it gets cold. Getting colder is like getting less hot, and getting hotter is like getting less cold. But for feeling, it's not at all that. What it is it's a bidimensional continuum. There's a 0 point, which is, if you put your hand in water that's neither hot nor cold, it feels like nothing. Okay, and then you increase the heat a little bit, it feels a little bit warm. You increase the cold, it feels a little cold. So there's two either side of that neutral point. But qualitatively, increasing heat does not feel like decreasing coldness. We know cognitively that it's temperature that's involved there, but increasing heat is one quality is going up, and that's warmness. And if you're on the other side of 0, another quality is going up or down, whatever you want to call it, and that's coldness. But they're not commensurable. They're not equal. They're not commensurable. Okay, it may even be that, depending on somebody's feelings, that they're pretty insensitive to cold, but they're terribly sensitive to warmth. So when you get above 0, it quickly gets excruciating. With the cold, you can go all the way down to near absolute 0 and say, no, it doesn't bother me. Keep on turning. So in other words, they're not the same continuum. They're two dimensions that are tail to tail, and they're not exchangeable. Now I'm going to put it in a more crude way. The utilitarians who think that it's a matter of maximizing total welfare, averaged across blah, 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 how many orgasms, how many whiplashes to you are equal to orgasms for me? Well, and it doesn't work between two people, and it doesn't work between n people. How many orgasms for n people equals how many whiplashes for m people. There's no such thing. It's just like that hot and cold thing I gave you. They're
so you think it's incommensurable? Is that because of biology? Is that the way it works?
Yes, it's biology.
Okay. I mean,
but it's obvious, and the utilitarians who talk about it like accountants that are sort of counting the utils, the positive utils and the negative utils, and assuming that they're equal, are just I won't use a.
There are negative utilitarians.
Yes, I'm a negative utilitarian of sorts, because that keeps me on one side of the 0 point. I say, obviously less suffering is better than more suffering. But that's the only thing that counts. There's no balancing it out with orgasms, and and it doesn't work across organisms. They say, how much do I have to torture you to compensate for making me feel a little bit less worse? That's nonsense. You're averaging across different sentient creatures.
Mm-hmm. So,
and yet, I said I am a negative utilitarian. All things being equal, less suffering is better than more suffering.
Sure. Do you think there's any point at which you'd grant the feeling of a pinprick for the sake of making like a whole civilization super happy?
Yeah, but that's trivial. I mean, when you get near to zero, nothing matters. Okay, so if you don't stay on the significant side of the scale, then we're just talking trivia.
Are you familiar with population ethics?
Not as such. We're sitting here as we talk. There is agony in the planet. And the only place there's any point talking morally about is reducing it. Nothing else. All this is about near 100 to this piece versus that piece. This is all just empty numerology for me.
Okay.
I mean, I'm motivated by the real felt suffering of pigs and cows and chickens and also people. And I'm not interested in doing numerology about, well, if I took this much, would that equal this, or would this be worse than that? That's
fair enough.
Not my territory.
Talk about human exceptionalism. I like a lot what the humanists are doing today. I still think that they're very human focused only. They've got a bit of a speciesism thing going on, at least the way I think about it. So, but the early human Enlightenment thinkers, such as Mirandola and that, were sort of counted the value of human dignity coming from its ability to rationalize or to do rationality. Yes, but I mean, you'd argue otherwise, wouldn't you?
I think that's a transparent anthropocentric bias. It just says we're rational, we count more. I think Bentham gave the right answer when he said it's not about rationality or intelligence; it's about suffering, and we can both we and other species can suffer. The only place where it becomes and that's not substantive. I mean, that's somebody else could say that we deserve more moral consideration because we have aesthetics and art. Who cares? The thing is, the only currency, the only thing that matters, the only thing that makes morality matter is suffering, and the only direction to go is less, not more. More is sadism and psychopathy and cruelty. So it's clear the direction it should go is to reduce the suffering. And the only quantity at issue is suffering. And we don't have to do the numerology. We can just say when there's something bad that's happening to a sentient organism, stop it. Okay. Now,
anything to do with
that? I think all I said was that Bentham had the right answer. That what counts is not the fact that we're rational, but the fact that we and they suffer, and it's only suffering that counts. So, and that's so simple. I mean, I like philosophy, and I like I talk about the hard problem of consciousness, etc., etc. There's things to be said there. That's not a moral discussion. That's just an intellectual discussion. Now we're talking morality, and I hate it when this kind of effete intellectuality interferes with what really matters, which is feeling.
So some say it's okay to eat animals if they are treated well, and the overall outcome is the negative well-being suffered by the animal while it's being slaughtered is justified if it produces positive well-being in the human eating.
That's right. Same thing. My orgasm for its suffering, right? Because I'm rational. My gustatory orgasm for his suffering justifies it. Anyway, no, I don't buy any of that. And in that particular case, I mean, there are times when, for example, encounters between predators and prey,
Yes.
where there's a conflict of vital interest.
Yeah.
The rhinoceros has to try to gore the lion, and the lion has to try to eat the rhinoceros because otherwise one of them dies. My morality I don't have a solution to there. I don't have a. There's another question you asked about biomedical research. I'll talk about that too. There's some things I don't want to touch because they're deep and tragic. I don't want to touch conflicts of interest. I'm not part of the La Horta group that says we've got to sterilize the predators and then there won't be any blah blah blah. That's nonsense. But apart from conflicts of vital interest, where there is no a priori answer, right? But maybe the only answer is that the right thing to do if there's a conflict of vital interest, is to pursue your own vital interest, try to survive. I don't want to say that you don't have the right to try to survive, the rhinoceros should win or whatever. So when it comes to eating animals, it's not necessary. It's simply not necessary for health or survival. And the moral principle then is, do not cause needless suffering. And what the example you gave about raising an animal and then slaughtering it is a clear example of needless suffering. It would be different if we were living in a subsistent culture where the only way to survive is by fishing. Otherwise, the people die. Then it's us against them, life and death. But most of the awful stuff on this planet is nowhere near like that. It's just unnecessary suffering out of habit, out of aesthetics, taste, stuff like that.
Okay, well, you mentioned the problem of other minds before. So what is the problem of other minds, firstly? And how does that relate to you're using a variant on the Turing test that can help humans recognize animal sentience?
The other minds problem, the original other minds problem was people to people, of course. It was rational, there was a philosophical skeptics pointing out. In fact, Descartes, if you like, it was one of the subscribers to it, that they're what can you be sure of? And he enumerated the things that you could be sure of, that you couldn't be sure of. He said, he would have said, it was before Newton, but he would have said, or can we be sure that apples are going to keep on falling down rather than up? And we can't be sure. It's highly probable. In fact, it's true. It's almost certainly true, but we can't be sure. The only things that we can be sure of are the deductively provable truths of mathematics that are true on pain of contradiction, and one other thing, the fact that I feel. Notice I didn't say cogito ergo sum, I just said the fact that I feel. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, supposes too much. I don't know what I means, I don't know what existence means, blah, blah, blah. But when I'm feeling a toothache, by the way, I'm feeling a toothache, it doesn't mean that my tooth has something wrong with it. Maybe it's not my tooth, it's referred pain from my jaw. Maybe I don't have teeth, maybe I don't have a head, maybe there's no outside world. All that stuff you can be skeptical about. But what you're feeling then, you can't be skeptical. You can't say, no, it doesn't feel like what it feels like. Maybe it isn't what it feels like, but but it certainly feels like what it feels like. So the two things you can be sure of are the truths of mathematics that are true on pain of contradiction, but that's just formal truths, and the fact that you feel. Okay? The skeptics knew that. And so one of the things you couldn't be sure of is that there's an outside world, that other people really exist, and if they exist, that they have minds, maybe they're just robots, etc. That was all part of the original skeptical whatever. And the right attitude to that is, yes, I recognize that it's not certain, so forget about certainty, except in mathematics and in the cogito. The rest of it is just probability, and live with it. It's no big deal. It doesn't have the universal implications. So much for the human to human other minds problem. Whether you have a mind or whether I don't, how can I be sure you have a mind? When it comes to non-human, and of course with humans, we have language that we sort of share that reinforces our belief in the probability that the other person has mind, and we'll get to the Turing test in a second. But with non-human species, there is no language. There's communication, but there's no language. And then I'm going to leave the area of philosophical, epistemological, blah, blah, skepticism, etc., and I'll go back to ethics and morality. whose other mind's problem is the other mind's problem? We tend to say, oh, I'm the philosopher sitting in the chair, and I'm puzzling over whether I can really believe that you have a mind. That's effete stuff to set aside. The other mind's problem is the problem of the other mind if I make the false assumption that he doesn't feel. It doesn't feel. I'm talking about non-human animals now. That's the other mind's problem. And that's what Animal Sentience, the journal that I edit and the cause that I follow, is about. Is there grounds for philosophical skepticism there? Not at all. Not at all. In reality, biological reality, it's true that the Turing test and Turing's Turing test was a verbal test for humans, and that's the right position to take when what you're trying to do is model what's going in. What is it that generates the human capacity to do everything that we can do? The reason the Turing test is about being completely indistinguishable from us in everything it can do. By us, I mean you and me, pygmies, not Einstein. The Turing test does not demand that the Turing candidate should be Einstein. It just demands generic human cognitive capacity. That's what's meant by intelligence. But it does it on the basis of performance. It does it on the basis of what it is that you do. In the verbal version of the Turing test, the one that everybody knows, but it's not the ultimate one, you have to be able to communicate verbally, by writing, if you like, or by email, for a lifetime, not for 10 minutes, not for a Loebner test, but for a lifetime, be able to communicate for a lifetime indistinguishably from another human being with a mind, right? And if there's nothing that you can't do, or that you do verbally, or that you can or can't do verbally, that makes someone say, aha, that's not the real thing, then you have no justification for being any more skeptical about the Turing test candidate than you are about another person, especially if you do the right version of the Turing test, which is not the verbal email version, but the robotic version. If you have a robot, go back to Aaron Solomon with this and run it by him. If you have a robot, me, just for the sake of argument, if it turns out, I've made in MIT, if you open my head, you'll see it's all the wrong stuff, okay? But otherwise, if I hadn't done that, and let's say I didn't for 20 years, you would say, come on, what's going on? I guess it means that they found a prosthesis, but you're still a thinking, feeling person with a mind. And that's the right answer. And that was Turing's insight. He said, once you have something that can do everything that a person with a mind can do, and you can't distinguish him from a person with mind, especially in the robot version, you can't tell them apart, then you have no better or worse grounds for assuming that it has a mind than you have for any other person.
Yes.
What happened?
If you had a lifetime to do it, but in the future, maybe we'll have AIs that are flawless at behaving like humans. So
you don't need a lifetime, Adam. I say it has to have a capacity of a lifetime, but it doesn't mean you have to test it for a lifetime. I mean, take your robot, walk it around. You quickly get out of Searle's Chinese room, walk it around the world and say, what's this? And then it tells you it's this, and you talk about it just like it's me, okay? So, you test me with email with a person, you could already do it. By talking about things that we've both seen and understand. There's no way that just a symbol pushing computer program can answer all of the right things. For example, between you and me, why did you send me the Google Docs link and not the Zoom link, right? That's stuff that you know, and that's stuff that I know, and with a little bit of interaction, we know what we're talking about. There's not a computer program that can anticipate in advance that this nonsense would happen today and understand what it is that happened. And if, in fact, using, what is this latest thing, GPT3 or whatever?
GPT3.
Yeah, right. If that thing can do it in words, then keep poking at it because the words are not based on understanding of the words. They're just based on having swallowed an awful lot of words before, and so putting out things that are very probable under those circumstances, which for most of us in our ordinary pygmy lives is enough. My conversation with barbers is something that whatever it's called, can handle. But when it comes to understanding, it takes more. It takes more to pass the robotic Turing test than just a chatbot. It requires symbol grounding. And you were going to ask me about symbol grounding. It requires the capacity to connect the words and the propositions with the things that they stand for. These things we have available when we're doing Turing testing for humans. With humans, we know what people can do. We don't know the whole ethogram, but we know most of what they can do. And we have terrific intuitions for whether they have a mind. The reason that we can bust a music composition program until today that's doing, Dan Dennett made a big deal about the fact that he could write Bach to a point where Bach appreciators can't tell it apart. Well, first it writes sort of low-grade Bach, non-masterpiece Bach at the level of non-masterpiece Bach, which nobody can tell apart anyway. But it doesn't go any further. And moreover, even if we listen to the non-masterpiece Bach for long enough, if we can listen to the program-generated ones, we have a very good capacity for picking out, aha, this is formulaic. I'm not saying, by the way, the people aren't sometimes formulaic, but we could pick out when a computer generator of music is doing that, and we can do it with what was it, TPS, GPS, etc. If you look at the other
GPT3, yeah,
GPT3 or what, 13 or whatever it was, if we look at those things long enough, it's good. It's enough to impress us for a while. But if we look at it long enough, the formulaic part, we're good at. Maybe it's not infallible, but it's remarkable how good we are at detecting mechanicity. And the other thing that we're really good at, which is much, much deeper, which is mind. We have tremendous mind-reading capacities. And the reason is because we're mammals, we have children, and we have to be able to second-guess what they need, want, and feel. Otherwise, our own genes aren't going to make it into the next generation. So we evolved a mind-reading capacity for our young and also for social relations. And that also makes us very good at Turing testing. The good news, though, is that we're mammals. And mammals are pretty much alike. We can mind read dogs. We can mind read pigs. Birds. We can mind read crows. We can mind read magpies, who are geniuses, by the way. Go and tell that to Magnolia, or whatever the name of that guy was that you quoted. Crows
Mirandola.
Mirandola. They're almost rational. But anyway, we can mind read animals. It's ridiculous to dismiss that as anthropomorphism. On the contrary, it's our best tool, along with ethology and observation and thinking and comparing and gathering data. We can decipher what it is that animals feel, and what they feel. And it's an analog of Turing testing, except in Turing testing, we're trying to generate somehow, not necessarily computationally, but in some way, the mechanism that generates the feeling. And then once we've got the mechanism that does it indistinguishably, then we can be certain, or as certain as we can with one another, that the thing feels. With animals, it's more of an approximation. The probability is very, very high, perhaps not quite as high as somebody who can talk to you. And then you went on to talk about bivalves, and you said, well, what about them? They don't have you said central nervous systems. They do have nervous systems. And remember my necessity criterion. You asked, okay, is it all right, or if it's not all right to raise animals and kill them for my orgasms, is it all right to harvest bivalves and eat them because they don't feel? No, it's not all right, because there we're still in the domain where they have nervous systems, nociceptive systems, which is damage detecting systems, which in all other species higher up are felt pain. And it's remember what I said about the real other mind's problem is that poor little oysters. If I think he doesn't feel, and he does.
It's just we don't know for sure yet, I think.
And it's enough on the side of we don't know about plants for sure either. But there's another story with plants. Plants don't have nervous systems, and therefore it makes it highly improbable that they have the machinery with which to feel. Moreover, behaviorally it doesn't make sense that they can't move. So what use is it to them to feel agony when you tear off their leaves, right? If it's a process that needs to be started, a repair process, this gets a little bit to the hard problem, because it's hard to explain why it is that people feel either. But if it's just a repair process, then why shouldn't the damage trigger the process? Why would you channel it through a feeling creature in the plant? In the case of a bivalve, it's different because a bivalve can do things. They can't do much, but they can do things, and they can escape from noxious stimulation. And so there's a behavioral reason, a neural reason to suppose that it does feel. With a plant, there isn't that, but it's not impossible. We're not skeptics. It's not impossible that plants feel too. But then we get to what I said about predators and prey. There we have no choice. We don't have to eat sentient creatures, but if animals. But if plants are sentient, we have no choice. It's a conflict of vital interests. We do ourselves in if we can't even eat plants. But the probability is that they don't feel. They're on the other side of zero, the improbable side of zero, whereas bivalves are on the probable side of zero.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. I mean, I think the natural point to transition now, like I was going to ask you about your personal reasons, because we've covered a lot of abstract stuff in philosophy here, and it's probably good to ground the discussion in your own personal experience there.
Why is the heater on at all? What season
It's
is
the
it
middle
in
of
Australia?
winter.
Oh, I see. And how winter does it get?
Well, actually, it's coming out of winter now, so it can get quite cold at night, and in the morning here.
Okay.
So we're at the bottom of Australia, not quite Tasmania, but quite
I've been
quite
to
low.
Melbourne. I've been to Melbourne.
Oh, you have? Oh, cool. For
Yeah.
conferences and such? Is that?
Yeah, I used to be, now you know that I'm a zealot for the only thing that there's any point being a zealot about, which is sentience. But I used to be a zealot stupidly for open access. And so I did a lot of proselytizing, arc evangelizing, and especially in Australia. I did a circuit where I did just about every university, at least on the Melbourne whatever side of the coast.
So is this just about open access to software or open access to things
Open
in
access
general?
to refereed research
Oh, yeah,
papers.
right. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Okay, so were there any events in your life that inspired you to become a vegetarian, and then later a vegan that you think's worth talking about?
I gave a quick answer in the written version. Maybe I'll give you a longer one now. No, and there's a reason for that. No, for as long as I can remember, it's been a premise, but a premise that I didn't think was could be acted on. That there's no, we have no right to hurt feeling creatures if we don't have to. But I assumed that we had to. Like everybody else. I mean, I was a vegetarian from the age of 17, and that was a long time ago. At that time, there weren't that many, at least in Montreal. But I became a vegetarian when I was in Manny's Delicatessen I was in high school, and I was still 16, and I had my woodwind quintet. I play horn, or I used to play horn, and a woodwind quintet includes oboe, flute, etc., and clarinet. The oboist, the rest of us were high school students. The oboist was older. He was a doctor. He was actually a dermatologist in his late 20s, I suppose. Not a very good oboist, Tom Sullivan. But he said at the table while we were eating, I was eating a turkey club sandwich at Manny's Delicatessen, that he had been a vegetarian. And I was shocked. I said, you're a medical man, a scientific man. How could you possibly be a vegetarian? It's bad for the health. He says, oh, no, it's not. He said, no, I don't. It's bad. It's not bad for the health. In fact, I think it might even be a little bit better for the health. And I was shocked, and I said, well, then why aren't you still a vegetarian? And he said, well, because I had to go into the Navy, and we were sent to sea, and there was only salt pork to eat, so I had to eat that. And then when I got back, I just never got onto it again. And this was 3 weeks before my 17th birthday, and so I said, well, I'm going to stop. I didn't think I would succeed. I thought the other thing was, all right, maybe you don't need it for health, but maybe it's really hard. And it turns out that it was ridiculously easy. But I have to add, and you can find this on Google, I am deeply ashamed for having been a vegetarian for nearly 50 years. Deeply ashamed, because of course I should have been a vegan. And I can tell you about how that happened.
Yep.
But in both cases, the important answer is that there was nothing new information. It was obvious that if you didn't have to do it, there was no need. Then it was wrong to do it. So much for being a vegetarian. But 10 years ago, here across the street at the Faculty of Law of McGill, where Alana Devine had a symposium on animal law, there were 3 speakers. One of them, I didn't say this in my written version to you, so there were 3 speakers. One of them was Alana Devine, who was a lawyer here at the SPCA and who talked about puppy mills and horrible things that people do with dogs and cats. And then there was a Swiss lawyer who was talking about the laws in Switzerland for protecting animals, and that was admirable. And the third person was least interesting to me. He was a lawyer from, I think, Yale or Columbia. But he had been working with the dairy industry in some way. But he started his talk saying, I understand what Alana Devine says about puppy mills, and we agree, and I agree about the welfare protections in Switzerland. It's a good thing. But now I'm addressing the vegetarians among you. You who think that being a vegetarian, you're abstaining from the horrors. Well, let me tell you that you're full accomplice in them. And then he said a few words. I mean, I knew already the horrors of the dairy industry and the fact that in the end it is the meat industry, because all of those calves are eaten and killed, and all of those cows are eventually killed. And so there, in 15 seconds, the token dropped. It didn't take 3 weeks like with the Montreal vegetarianism, and I became a vegan, and I never looked back. And it turned out to be I also thought it would be hard, and I thought I would be playing with my health at a later stage in my life, and it's nothing of the sort. It was ridiculously easy, and gets easier. I mean, after 8 months, my palate changed completely, and all stuff that while I was a so-called vegetarian, but actually I was a carnivore because I was eating animal protein anyway. Stuff that tasted like nothing to me started to taste. It was like movies went from black and white to Technicolor.
Wow.
So. But the answer to your question is, what did it? Ignorance on my part prevented me from doing it. A more enterprising spirit would have ferreted out the truth. I would say, this is so awful, I have to find out more about it. These days, the truth is spreading more widely and more quickly, and that's a good thing. And that's what I'm devoting my life to, which is to informing and sensitizing people about how, first, it's not necessary at all for your health, and number 2, what horror, that's the most important thing, what horrors it causes. I mean, my biggest enemy is Ag-gag, the people that try to hide the horrors from people, not let them realize what it is that they're sanctioning when they eat meat and dairy and so on. So compared to that, my arch-evangelism is completely trivial. It's as stupid as my vegetarianism.
What are you doing to substitute for some of the things that some people are saying you can only get from animal products?
There's no such thing.
Some people believe that you can only get protein from animal products.
Some people think that the moon is made out of cheese. The point is, it's false. I don't want to say that like a journalist. There's this on for one side. It's false. All the protein you need can be gotten from vegetables. The only difference between getting it from meat and from getting it from vegetables and grains is that you have to eat a variety of vegetables and grains to get it, whereas with meat, it's one-stop shopping. But that's trivial. That's trivial. And moreover, the change that happens when you become a vegan is that all sorts of stuff that didn't taste like anything starts to taste good. Your metabolism, which has switched from carnivore to herbivore, we're normally omnivore, is now making stuff taste tasty in order to get you to eat it. There were experiments which I reject because it was done on rats and it was cruel. But there were experiments done on rats where they would deprive them, not to the point of killing them, but to the point of producing a deficit in their metabolic deficit from some foods. I have to start a little bit earlier. Rats are extremely smart. and extremely, I mean, they have wonderful personalities. They also have xenophobia in food because they have co-evolved with us, and they're so used to the fact that somebody is trying to poison them that they're extremely leery about eating anything that they haven't eaten. In general, a rat that's growing up, a baby rat, will only eat stuff that his mother has fed him, and there's only one other thing: stuff that he smelled on the breath of another healthy rat that has eaten it. That they'll try, but other than that, they're completely phobic about eating stuff they haven't eaten. But if you deprive them of some essential nutrients, they develop a voracious appetite for the stuff that contains those nutrients. And so when you give them even unfamiliar food, but they can sense the nutrient, it overcomes their bait shyness, and they have this special appetite for the stuff that they need, and then they compensate it. If you give them cafeteria-style food, then with their noses and their tasters, they balance it out and they become fine again. Well, something like, we're not in deficits, but something analogous to that happens when you become a vegan. And I also think that the switch from carnivore to herbivore is the complete, not the partial, but the complete absence of animal protein. That's when your body knows, I'm a herbivore. I better make the things that I need tasty, and that's what happens. This complete protein business is complete nonsense. Yes, it's true that meat and a few non-meat things too are complete protein, but you don't have to go for the soya all the time. You can eat just a variety of vegetables and grains, and you get it all. And it's a more enjoy. I never used to cook. I didn't think I was any good at it, and I didn't care. And of course, all those years that I was vegetarian, I was really a carnivore. And so I was like the kids who won't eat their vegetables because who cares? You know, I can get it all. So I ate a lot of cheese. Now, I can't say I've become a zealous cook, but now I actually cook because it's fun. I used to think that vegans were obsessed with food was because they couldn't get enough that was good to eat. But now I know it's not that at all. It's because their taste buds have been awakened to all kinds of stuff that they were numb to before, like the kids who don't eat their vegetables because it doesn't taste like anything. It's still black and white.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned animal experimentation there slightly,
Yeah, okay.
in reference to the rats you're talking about. But that's fascinating. You seem to have a bit of a disgust response when you
Yeah,
spoke
yeah,
about the animal experimentation there. When do you
yeah.
think it is necessary? When do
Justify.
you think it's
Okay.
justifiable?
It's
And
one of the two things that I don't have a moral solution for. One is a conflict of moral vital interests, and in fact, this is a conflict of moral vital interest. But first, let me say, this is true about all scientific research, not just biomedical research. All scientific research, the majority of it, does not save lives, does not help anybody. It's driven by curiosity, career, funding, fashion. Okay, that's why most people are doing research. It's only a small portion of biomedical
hmm,
research that really does save lives, but there is a non-zero portion of biomedical research that does save lives, and it's tragic that this is a tragic conflict of interest. But I don't think this is now, while we're doing countless obscene amounts of causing obscene amounts of suffering without any life at stake, namely just for taste or for food, for fun, for fur, for fashion, etc. At this point, we should not be debating what about the small part of scientific research that really is life-saving. That's not the issue. That's a good way, by the way, and lots of people who are opposing abolition use that. They say, well, what about that? What about the life-saving research? Leave life-saving research alone for the moment. Stop doing the 99.9% of the horrors that are completely unnecessary.
right, to what research a better form, like a new form of lipstick or something.
Yeah, well, it's even stuff that pretends to be for COVID isn't all for COVID. By the way, COVID is turning out to be extremely interesting, and
Okay.
there are two outstanding hypotheses about how it is that we can wean people from doing this. One of them is the one that I subscribe to, which is that you have to sensitize them by informing them rationally that they don't need it, and by informing them emotionally of the horrors. Okay, so sensitization is one way, and that's why I fight Ag-gag, and why I militate for having CCTV cameras, like in England, in all locations where people are using animals, and web streaming it live and archiving it on the web so that people can see in real time what is being done for their bacon and their cheese, etc. I think that's what would and will convert, because people aren't psychopaths. They're just ignorant about this. They're kept ignorant by Ag-gag. But the other hypothesis is that's not enough. You're basically going to have to satisfy their taste. You got to have to give them the orgasms they want, okay, the gustatory orgasms. And so that's the other. And I'm about to lose a doctoral student in cognitive science, very bright, because he's a vegan, and he's now gotten very enthused about stem cell generation of milk, and he's going to leave his thesis, his PhD with me to do that, and he's welcome to do it, because
That
it's
was
much more
another question
important.
of mine. Yeah.
Much more important. But the third one, which is okay, it would be a very sad, I think, testimony to the history of humanity if the only thing that made them finally stop doing the eternal Treblinka for animals was that they managed to get their cheese taste and milk and meat equivalent by some other means. That's awful. That would be an awful. But never mind. I'll take it. Whatever does it fastest,
Yes,
whether
exactly.
it's the sensitive, I'll take it. But the third one might be even faster, which is it's turning out, and it's. I read an article by just 3-4 weeks ago by David Wiebers and Valerie Fagan, who's the editor of the journal Neuroepidemiology, which publishes an awful lot of awful things people do to animals. I, by the way, was an editor of a journal that published things. I wouldn't publish anything that was reporting results on animals in my journal, Behavioral and Brain Sciences. I wouldn't. But they discussed stuff that had been published elsewhere. So I was an accomplice in that, just like the dairy industry. Well, anyway, in this journal, there was an article about what COVID is telling us about the future, about the future.
I read the abstract, I think.
Yeah, well, there's much more to, the one that I just sent you, which is that the cause of almost all of these pandemics is zoonotic. It's caused by the contact between, not necessarily even direct contact, but under anthropogenic influences, anthropogenic influences, other species have been pushed together that wouldn't have been together either. So if you drive people, organisms out of their habitat and force them into the habitat of another organism, like a bat, if you drive pangolins into the environment of the bat, then the zoonotic transmission of flipping of bat viruses can go into the pangolin, and then the pangolin, by a similar chain, because we're doing horrible things to the humans are directly doing horrible things to pangolins. Pangolins are like, they're mammals with scales, and they're wonderful. I mean, they're in that subset. All mammals are wonderful, but manatees and pangolins, it's all of it is a crime. But those are like super capital crimes. Anyway, we consume pangolins, and they bring us the COVID virus in these wet markets, and it passed. And you don't have to just go to wet markets and pangolins. And we have them in the slaughterhouses that we have here. We have them in the breederys. I work on this, and I interact with activists on this too. The Ag-gag involves showing how pigs are raised, how chickens are raised, how cows are raised, how dairy cows are raised. It's horrible. It's unbelievable. And it also creates zoonotic illnesses. The pig virus, the pig flu, we were lucky on that one, but we're getting less and less lucky because the frequency of these pandemics is going up and the intensity of it is going up. So they happen more and more often, and they're worse and worse. This was the latest. Even COVID was relatively lucky. It could have been worse, and it's going to be worse. And the argument of this article was, if you want to put an end to this stuff that's going to get worse and worse, just like climate change, and in fact it's related to climate change, you're going to have to abolish animal use.
What about pets?
All right, I can talk about that too. Um, Pets, what you have to remember about pets is that for every happy story you can tell about a
Mm,
cat or a dog that lived a wonderful life from
mm,
till a happy old age, etc., etc., for every one of them, because they're all bred, there's
mm,
others that ended up in terrible homes, baked in a car because they were left in the car when it's hot, ended up strays, ended up abused, ended up with diseases that weren't treated. So in other words, the price we pay for the orgasm of having a domestic pet is enormous for the others, for the parallel streams, for the ones that don't end up in good hands. So I am for abolishing that, but for the time being, and for another reason too, because they're fed with meat. And
mm-hmm,
tons of animals are being killed to feed our orgasm pets.
mm,
But for the time being, while people still have domestic contact with domestic animals, it's good for sensitizing them to animals. And if you must have a pet, get a saved pet and not a bred pet.
yeah, yeah. My mum would always take in strays,
Yeah.
stray cats, and I grew up with them. And I guess I developed an affinity for the animals for doing that. And I wouldn't say no to having a cat just because they're so cute. But yeah,
No,
I
we're not
agree with
asking.
you. I
We're
agree
not
with you
asking
in
about having
abstract.
it. We're not asking about having a cat. We're talking about breeding a cat.
Breeding the
Of
cats, yeah.
course, you should save a cat, and it's wonderful, and they're wonderful. Listen,
Hmm.
I lost. I don't want to get into it because I'm going to break down. But I lost a very much loved cat for 2 months ago.
Oh, sorry.
Um, the only thing that I can say is that now that Sindri's died, I because she was very sick for a long time, I can devote myself completely to the animals that need to be saved,
Mm,
and so.
mm, yeah.
But it's good for sensitizing. The first hypothesis, as I said, was sensitize people to animal suffering and
Mm,
animals. There's this wonderful guy in New York. He's sort of a thug. You would have thought that he was the kind of person that put cats in microwave ovens,
mm,
but he was that type. But he has a film called Witness. But what happened was he had a cat and he fell in love with the cat. I mean, not erotically in love, but
yeah, sure.
it became like his child,
Mm,
and it converted him to becoming a vegan and an activist. And he said, I realized when I was holding her leg that this is the same as the leg of the chicken that I was eating, and so on
mm,
and so forth. So cats, especially, dogs are wonderful. They're very human-like, and I love them. And I had one in my life, and I could never replace her. But
mm,
cats somehow convert people even more than dogs to veganism, oddly
mm,
enough. And they're the obligate carnivores. Dogs can be omnivores like us. Cats are obligate carnivores. I fed her meat.
mm,
I guess I'm not a vegan. I fed her meat. There was vegan cat food here, but I started her on it, but it made her even sicker, and she had so many illnesses already that I
mm,
just couldn't do it. That was a conflict of vital necessity,
mm-hmm.
vital interests.
And so, how did you deal with that personally?
Personally, I fed her it was proximal. Okay, it's like she was my child, and I would not sacrifice the life of my child. When right, remember that chickens, especially chickens, I
Mm,
think they're the main food. Chickens are being treated horribly, monstrously, for no reason.
mm,
Not right, and
absolutely.
I can even give you an analogy to this. Sindri was a sick cat who was made sick by every change in diet, and I didn't. She was already sick enough. I didn't want to make her sicker. But we once had a little vegan in a meeting who asked. She says, I myself, little vegan, have an illness for which I have to take a medication, a component of which is animal. What shall I do? And we all said, take it. Because what this is about is not making a little vegan die because of this, while 99.9% of humanity is eating chickens for nothing. Become an activist, be a vegan, etc., and take what you have to take for now. It's the same. It's this.
Mm,
It joins with the tragic question of the biomedical research. There's some cases where it's really a conflict of vital interests, and in there we have no solution.
mm. Well, I mean, I'd like to. zoom in and zero in on clean meats because a lot of my friends are really interested in this, and so am I.
Define it for me.
Okay, so I mean, protein supplementation is probably the most abstract I can get, and it doesn't necessarily have to come from an animal cell, but even if it does, one animal losing a cell, I think, is like a pinprick.
I agree. That's not the issue there.
Mm.
The issue, it's really, we discussed it already in a sense. This
Mm-hmm.
is the second hypothesis, which is duplicate the taste. It's
Mm-hmm.
not necessary, but if you insist that you want to get the taste and the feel, do it with clean meat. If you can do it with clean meat fast enough to end the suffering before sensitization or COVID does, go ahead. But
Sure.
otherwise, there's nothing special about it. I answered it. You don't need this. You don't need this for your health, and you don't need it for your taste. Because if you simply became a vegan, your taste would modify, and you'd get all the orgasms you want via plant foods. But
But
via
how well are we doing at convincing people of this, right? I mean,
not
how
very
many
well.
people can you actually convince with that argument?
Not
I'd
very
say saying,
well.
so the idea that we can actually produce clean meat, which is economically and taste competitive to normal meat, it then
But it's a
becomes.
Yes, but right now it's a fantasy. It's a reality that you can do it with plants. It's a
Mm,
fantasy that we could give people the taste in meat and cheese that they want that will make them say, okay, fine, forget about it's a fantasy. So what are you suggesting? That we should be patient for the fantasy to realize itself? I told you I lost a student to the fantasy, not the fantasy, to the hope, okay? But
yeah.
right now it's a fantasy because it's not there. It's not there.
Well,
No,
I've
there's
seen
no
it. It
point.
has. It is. There is alternatives out there. They're expensive, but there is alternatives. But I mean, we know that in a not too distant future, that or at least we can hope. Aren't you willing to, not
Of
be totally
course,
devoted from? Okay, so you can have
of
two
course. I said
strategies going at the same time. Is basically what I'm trying to say.
three strategies actually. Sensitize them to the horrors and the non-necessity. Second
Mm,
one is doing what you're saying. It's basically that's what you're saying. Develop stuff that's going to be just that'll make them give up the meat for that.
mm,
And the third one is scare the shit out of them with the truth
mm.
about pandemics.
Right. And there's also the environmental impact of farming
Yes.
animals, right?
Both ways. I mean, what is an environmental impact? I mean, rocks are not sentient. Plants are not sentient. The reason environmental impact matters, why it's a moral matter, is because it has an impact on sentient creatures. And one of the impacts is zoonotic. So it ends up being the same thing. Greta Thunberg is a vegan for environmental reasons.
Is there anything you'd like to say about anything more that we haven't actually covered? You'd like to say about animal suffering and the activism that we can engage in order to reduce that?
Uh, I wish I knew. I mean, I'm following the sensitization hypothesis. My student is following the clean meat hypothesis, and I'm also actually. I mean, since we're gonna publish this article this week, and then there's going to be open peer commentary on it from over 200 epidemiologists, immunologists, veterinary science, etc., etc. So yeah, that's on the rational side. I suppose we can try to work on the scientific evidence that it's the best analogy I can think of is finally COVID has made the problem of meat and or yeah basically animal use closer to the problem of smoking, because with smoking
Mm.
it was hard to get people to stop, etc., 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 and it was for their own good. Whereas with animals, we can't say it's for your own good. I don't lie and say that you're going to become. It does make you a little bit better in some ways, but it's not for your health. It's for their health that you need to convert. Well, maybe it is for your health because of COVID.
Hmm. Interesting.
So that's new. Uh,
Well, another thing that I was going to bring up, and it relates to what you were talking about, is there was quite a bit of disinformation campaigning going on by the tobacco lobbyists in the day. Do you think that's also happening in the meat industry today?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned it. The biggest enemy is ag-gag. And the point that what ag-gag, which basically the food industry is trying to do, is hide the horrors and pretend that it's necessary for your health. And they're doing it. They've got the money to do it. I said I was an open access evangelist, and I kind of lost the battle. I was fighting for what's called green open access, which means every person who writes an article and is accepted for publication makes it freely available on the web in a repository or something like that. That's green open access. I lost that battle to open access, but it was gold open access. What happened was that the big publishers, Elsevier being the biggest one, just figured out a way of offering open access through them by charging the author instead of the institution that subscribes for access. And so basically they ended up, I don't care, it's all trivial. In the end, we have open access, but it's the wrong way. And I don't care that we're paying through the yin-yang for it, whereas we could have had it for much less and we could have saved money and we could have used it for something better. But Elsevier won because they're big and because they have really deep pockets, and they basically bought up all of they bought up repositories. In the end, the green repositories are controlled by Elsevier. Well, it's the same thing in the food industry, and they're much, 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 much bigger. They are trying to block the evidence from our eyes, and they're also the evidence for the suffering, and to block the evidence for the fact that it's not necessary for our health from our minds. And they have the money to do it, and it's a media thing.
Right. I guess it helps that they can't block the internet at the moment. They can just, I guess, crowd out stuff. I mean, like the internet is open access, but it does seem as though it's getting harder and harder for them to sort of completely control channels of information flow there.
Yeah, I would think so, except that how come Trump's still in there? How come the information doesn't get through to everybody? There seems to be a way to channel people's attention to basically fake news, and I think the industry knows how to do that and has much more money. I mean, I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think the food industry is bigger than the oil industry, and so they have more money because everybody eats. Not everybody, flies. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but they have more money to spend on disinformation than anybody.
Yeah.
And a lot of look at the Republicans. I mean, the Republicans are rolling back all of the animal protections. That's despite the information that's available. So I don't know. I'm weakest in political things because it appalls me. I mean, just the very fact that there can be a Trump is kind of it seems like an impossibility to me, and yet it's true. So I don't know. But yes, by the way, some people are worried about, what was the thing that you could keep correcting me on how to say?
GPT-3.
Yeah, GPT-3. People are worrying that GPT-3 is going to make this worse, because people will use GPT-3 to generate a lot of
to generate a whole lot of media content that's biased and fake news. Right. Yeah. I hope not.
I hope not too.
There,
you know what? The segue to the symbol grounding problem should be that. The reason I believe that that's not going to work is because GPT-3 is ungrounded. Same reason Searle's argument, Chinese room argument, works, which is that and the same reason Turing's test in the verbal form, if conducted by a computer only, in other words, just symbol manipulation, I say it wouldn't pass the Turing test. You just can't. With just symbol pushing, you can't get something that for a lifetime can do verbally everything that a human can do. You can fool people for a while,